So let me go ahead and introduce you. So we can start this session. So we're going to go ahead, vamos a empezar la sesión. Tenemos de la tarde tenemos a Chuck Goldman con Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. Él nos va a estar dando la perspectiva, escuchamos la perspectiva esta mañana, la perspectiva de los ESPCs. Esos son los contratos de rendimiento energético, de cómo es que está temperado para Puerto Rico. Chuck nos va a dar una reseña de lo que se está viendo en los Estados Unidos. También tenemos oportunidades pues para hacerle preguntas y pues lo tenemos como recurso. Así que por favor siéntese en la mayor libertad pues de hacer preguntas mientras él está haciendo su presentación. So Chuck, I introduced you, but maybe what you want to do is just to give a little bit snippet of your background, Chuck, and you have it from here.
Okay, thank you, Jorge. I have been listening this morning to Jorge Hernandez, and the speaker on the lead shows. I have a slideshow that I will be sharing with you, a PowerPoint. I have been at Lawrence Berkeley Lab for about 35 years, and for the last 20 to 25 years, I have been working closely with the ESCO industry in the U.S. We have a number of research projects that support the ESCOs, and I will be sharing with you the results of them. My goals here really at a very high level are Jorge Hernandez shared with you some very good information about the ESCO industry in Puerto Rico and specific projects that he has done. What I'm going to do is give you a bigger picture and share with you results from thousands of projects that have been done over the last 20 years, as well as surveys of the ESCO industry to give you a sense of this industry and how it has worked in the U.S. So again, my work is supported by the U.S. Department of Energy. We are providing technical assistance to states, primarily public utility commissions and energy offices. We are independent and unbiased. We are researchers. These are the topics that I hope to cover today. I want to show you some other pictures about the performance contracting business and ESCO business models. This will build off some of the work that Jorge Hernandez shared with you, but I will show you one or two other models in addition to shared savings. We're going to talk about the historic performance of ESCO projects. I will share with you the kinds of projects that have been done in the states, information on the types of energy efficiency measures and on-site generation measures that are installed, project costs. We'll talk about savings in projects, the range of savings that we experience and have found. And then we'll talk about payback times in projects in the U.S. and what's happened. And big theme of my talk will be trends over time. In some sense, Jorge was sharing with you results from an industry in Puerto Rico that is relatively young. It hasn't been done for that many years in Puerto Rico. I will be showing you results from longer time periods, and you will see that results from the last several years in the U.S. are somewhat different than they were 20 years ago. I will sum up some of the key takeaways about the ESCO business, and then I will conclude with a short discussion of different energy efficiency strategies, ratepayer-funded efficiency programs, performance contracting, low-income weatherization and financing, and talk about some of the issues involved with each of these approaches that are complementary to each other, but how they may relate to the Puerto Rican context. So that's the game plan. I hope that you ask questions along the way. I will stop at various places. Feel free to ask questions. It's a discussion.
Fantastic.
So my computer, okay. So here are the data sources that I will be talking about. These are research projects at LB&L, where I work. We have had a database of ESCO projects for the last 20 years. We partner with the trade association called NESCO. This database has over 6,000 projects in it, representing $16-17 billion of investment. In the last 4 or 5 years, the Department of Energy has also been funding us to develop a project tracking system for ESCO projects called eProject Builder. The ESCO database contains project-level information and information on project costs and savings. eProject Builder has that information, but it also contains data on actual measure-level savings and costs. Much more detailed data, starting out with the federal market in the U.S., but building from that. The ESCO database on the top shows all market sectors: universities, colleges, hospitals, schools, government buildings, private sector, commercial. eProject Builder mostly has projects from the federal sector, federal market. And then at LB&L, we do surveys every 3 or 4 years of the ESCO chief executive officers and finance people, and we ask them information to us on a confidential basis to provide us their annual revenues, their projected revenues for the next 3 years, what's their market activity by region in the U.S., and what market sectors are they working in. And we ask them some questions about trends that they see in the ESCO business. We've done this survey 3 or 4 times over the last 10 or 15 years, and I will share with you some of the results. So this is the definition of an ESCO that we use for our work at LB&L. ESCOs are companies that provide energy efficiency related and other value-added services, and for which performance contracting is a core part of their energy efficiency services business. And in a performance contract, the ESCO either guarantees or shares energy and dollar savings for a project, and the ESCO's compensation is linked in some way to the performance of the project at the customer's site. Usually, I think of ESCOs actually as project developers, and they're in the business of improving end-use efficiency. And these companies combine engineering expertise with knowledge about financial services to extract the potential for energy efficiency in buildings and facilities. But the ESCO also has to be pretty sophisticated. They integrate a broad range of services, from identifying projects, doing audits, engineering and design work, arranging financing, the actual construction of a project, measurement and verification of savings, maintenance, and then some kind of financial billing for the project savings and cost. The ESCO doesn't do all of these things themselves necessarily. Sometimes they contract out portions of this work, like oftentimes installation is done by lighting contractors or HVAC contractors, but they are the project manager, the developer. And performance contracting, the ESCO's compensation is tied to the project's performance in some way. So this is a picture from Johnson Controls that shows sort of an idealized version of what a project's cash flow looks like from a customer's perspective. The ESCO has technical know-how. They offer a bundle of measures: energy efficiency, water, maybe renewables, and on-site generation. They take full responsibility from the project from start to finish till it gets from audits to commissioning. They have a performance guarantee, and this chart shows you that before the ESCO project, you have some utility costs. After the project, you have energy savings or operational savings. So the customer's energy or water bill is lower. The customer pays back the investment over time. And then, and hopefully the combination of paying back the investment plus the new utility bill is lower than the customer's utility bill before the project. There's some savings. And then what happens is the contract is for a certain length of time, 10 years, 5 years, 15 years. And after the contract is over, some of the measures still are producing savings, and in that case, the customer receives all of the savings for the project. This picture is an example of a guaranteed savings contract. It's a little bit different than a shared savings contract, but this is the mental picture that ESCO tries to sell a customer when they do one of these projects. So here is a chart. It's an old picture that gives you a breakdown of project costs in typical ESCO projects. And there are several things I want to highlight here. The first thing is that the equipment and installation and the design are, roughly 60 to 80% of the project. But the ESCO incurs substantial other costs to develop a project. So when you have ESCOs as businesses, they have to cover their costs of doing proposals, doing prospecting. Not every project goes forward. So the projects that do go forward have to cover the costs of those that don't. The ESCO incurs some costs in identifying projects, and the ESCO spends 3 to 5% measuring and verifying the savings. And there's some transaction costs in terms of an ESCO contract. This is a relatively complex contract for a customer to sign compared to just purchasing equipment.
So Chuck, one of the things that we were hearing this morning is that on these kind of arrangements, the performance, the energy savings performance contracts, there's no capital cost?
There is no capital cost? Is that what you said?
Yes. So that's what we were hearing this morning.
There's no upfront capital cost to the customer, right. Typically in an ESCO project. The customer, essentially the customer is taking out a loan. They're financing either the ESCO is financing it or a third party is financing it, and the customer is paying back debt service over the life of the contract.
Okay.
We will get into that a little bit more when we look at the next two business models.
Great.
So I wanted to give you this picture because it shows the kinds of projects, business models that ESCOs do in the U.S. In the U.S., the ESCO business model has changed over time. When the ESCO started out 20, 25 years ago, it was almost exclusively shared savings. That is the kind of arrangement that Jorge Hernandez described to you this morning for the work that his company is doing. That was very typical of ESCOs 15, 20 years ago in the U.S. And it is still the case that shared savings is more popular in the private sector. And Jorge shared with you some of the companies that he has worked with. But in the U.S., what's happened over time is that guaranteed savings has become the dominant performance contracting type of business. And that's in part because ESCOs in the States are mainly doing work in government buildings, schools, universities, hospitals. And I will talk a little bit more about why guaranteed savings has become popular in those types of buildings. It's also worth noting that ESCOs in the U.S. oftentimes do more than performance contracts. Sometimes they do design build and fee-for-service contracts. I think Jorge talked to you about his company does that as well. Well, that's pretty typical. A lot of ESCOs do both. And you can see that in the private sector, maybe 30% of ESCO projects are design build. So now we're going to talk a little bit about a mental picture of what a guaranteed savings contract looks like. What's the deal? So under guaranteed savings, the customer finances the project in return for a guarantee from the ESCO that the project's energy savings will cover the customer's debt service. The customer assumes the obligation to repay the debt to a third-party financier. If the project savings fall short of the amount needed for the debt service payment, the ESCO pays the difference. If the savings exceed the guarantee, then the customer and the ESCO share the excess savings. The ESCO has no contractual relationship with a lender. That's important. The ESCO guarantee is to the customer for the performance of the project. The lender, the financier, when they think about this project, they focus on the risk analysis of the customer's general credit standing. They want to lend money to credit-worthy customers. And the project finance portion is typically a debt-like vehicle, a loan, a capital lease, a municipal lease, and so on. And it's backed by the owner. The customer takes that risk. And so this is the kind of structure that is popular in the U.S., and it's very common in the public institutional markets. And one of the reasons it's popular is that in the U.S., in the States, these customers do not have capital budgets. They are when we think about an ESCO project, what you're doing really is you are getting new equipment, updated equipment, you're modernizing your facility, and you're using the energy and operational savings to pay for it.
Chuck,
That's
I have a
what's really
question.
happening in most of these deals.
Yeah, I have a question.
Now that's different than maybe the situation in Puerto Rico, where Jorge Hernandez is telling you that, the shared savings deal that he's looking at, customers want significant savings. They want lower utility bills. They're sharing that work. And some of those companies have capital budgets and they could pay for it themselves, but they may not want to take on the debt or the financing, or the deal is good.
Yeah, I think we have a question on the room, Chuck.
Sure.
Yeah, the question I have is that when Jorge was presenting this morning, that this seemed like a good option for Puerto Rican government agencies that last year they registered something like a $300 million debt with PREPA that they were having difficulty paying. So the reason why that would be good is because if they can engage an ESCO and get into this type of arrangement, they don't need to put up money up front. They just need to pay the ESCO from their savings. But the question I have is they need some additional enticement, as in how would you structure it? Two questions. How would you structure it so that the actual savings are more than what they have to pay back, so that they have the added incentive that there's that they actually have some savings above and beyond what they're spending. And the second question is, would you recommend some kind of incremental process by which they don't have to see all the savings at once, but maybe it could be like a multi-year process with benchmarks and different goals and objectives? What do you think?
So that is a complicated question, and I want to give you a several-part answer. One of the challenges in government buildings in Puerto Rico in this model is that the lender and financier is looking for credit-worthy customers who are going to, they are confident that they assess the credit risk. So in the states, they're lending money to state governments, local governments, universities, schools, and in general, these entities pay their utility bills, are not going to go out of business, and have good credit. So they get attractive financing. If you don't have that situation in Puerto Rico, it is tough to make this model work. Now, you asked some specific questions which go beyond that. In general, these deals, the savings come over the lifetime of the project. They do not happen all at once, you're right. And the picture I showed you that the savings increase after the contract is paid off. They're 5 or 10% in the first couple of years, and they get bigger at the end. You asked this thing about I guess that was one part of your question. I'm not sure. You have to repeat the other part.
Yeah, the other part is about an incremental type arrangement where they have some benchmarks. The first year, their overall goal might be a reduction of 30%, but you're only going to achieve 50% or 5%. You're only going to achieve 5% in the first stage, and then you're going to go to a second stage. If that works out, then you're going to save another 5%. So that it's incremental, and they can see the cost benefit up front, even if not all the savings happen up front.
So that's a great question. It is very common in the U.S. for institutional public customers to do projects in in bite size. They start off with a lighting project and maybe some HVAC. If the ESCO does a good job and they see the savings, then maybe they'll do on-site generation, or they'll get a new chiller and a boiler. So it's very common. ESCOs have a lot of repeat business. And I will show you pictures, a slide of ESCOs who tell us a share of new customers versus repeat business. I have a slide that shows you that. So we should come back to that.
Chuck, I'm sorry to interrupt. My name is Carlos Tejera. I work for the Energy Policy Program in Puerto Rico. And I just wanted to mention something that maybe is not known. We agree that these models could be great if they could work for the government of Puerto Rico. The thing is that having now the fiscal board in Puerto Rico, they do not allow the government to establish any multi-year contract or agreement. So that would kind of set up a hurdle in the process. So this is something we have talked for, quite time, looking for answers, and just to let you know that that's a hurdle we're facing right now, and this is something we need to work on, maybe to have this opportunity for the government to use it.
Chuck, I think that's a very important point, I tell you, because in Puerto Rico, there are many actors. So the issue of the Fiscal Oversight Management Board is something that is affecting. And it's good that we're articulating that, because there are some barriers in regards to that arrangement.
Well, Jorge,
So I did not go into the history of this stuff, but you are correct. In the U.S., most public agencies cannot sign multi-year contracts unless there is legislation and rules that allow it. There are right now 47 states, 48, that have that kind of legislation. But you're right, the ESCOs and others have passed this legislation, and then this legislation identifies a lead government agency that makes the rules. And that's the process that's used before you even get to this place of where a public customer could consider it. You have to have that in place. If that is an issue in Puerto Rico, and I have heard that it is, that there is energy savings performance contracting legislation that is written in Puerto Rico. I've looked at it, and I've also been told that there are other legislation that limits public agencies from signing multi-year contracts. I have not seen that other legislation, but I've been told it exists.
Yeah, we have Jorge. He's gonna add a little bit more to that. Yeah.
hi, Chuck. Jorge.
And make sure that he can hear you through the, yeah.
We were talking about that before, in the last few weeks about the laws. We have, and we know the law that I had to look for it. Where is the sad page was said that you cannot have a multi-annual contract. I think, and we discussed that as a strategy. You have a law that says that you have to achieve 40% reduction by performing contracting primarily up to 15 years in order to reduce your budget and use those savings for the general budget of Puerto Rico. I think that the Energy Office here, the DOE, we have to discuss with the Control Board and have this open discussion, because how you can do a public alliance, a private-public alliance, that is this, una APP, where you bring a private sector to invest in a highway or in an airport, 2 examples, and we discussed that with Marrero. I think there is something misunderstanding in that law that come in the 2017, and the Control Board, I think that is looking that you don't have multi-annual contract in something that is another multi-annual expense. But energy performance is no expense. It's a saving that we are sharing, and you keep the rest to do whatever you want. And I think that the strategy of the policy is my recommendation, Carlos. And I talked before, we have been talking about that. I talked with Chuck, I talked with Jorge Camacho. I think that in order to open the valve of water, you don't have the money in the budget. Some people, some companies, some institutions don't have the money, but they have the expense, the budget to pay the utilities. And we need some type of guarantee that that saving can be used, and there will be guarantee saving for the government. And you will see that there is no contradiction between the laws.
That's fantastic. So thank you for that recommendation. I think that's a barrier that has been identified. So you got it now, Chuck.
Jorge, so this picture shows what Jorge Hernandez is saying, essentially. That what happens in an ESCO project is, in the red, the ESCO is paying back some of the investment, but it's still, it's part of their energy and operating costs. But it's a debt payment, and then they have lower utility bills. And then hopefully there are some savings in addition to that.
Yep.
Okay, I'm going to move on. This is an example of a shared savings or energy services agreement. This is a more complex picture, and this is a picture of what shared savings looks like in the States today. It's not what it looked like 20 years ago, but these are companies that are offering this service. So let me try to walk you through this graph. First, the customer is paying for the energy savings, and they generally contract to provide these at a certain rate per kilowatt hour, which will be less than the utility cost per kilowatt hour used. So this is the concept of the savings that Jorge Hernandez was talking about. The energy service agreement provider is delivering a service, and that's what makes it a service agreement. It's not a loan or a lease. Since the customer is paying for the service, they may be able to recognize the payments as an operating expense that can be off balance sheet. It also insulates the customer from the risk, since it means that if no savings are realized, they don't have to pay. With a loan or a lease, like in guaranteed savings, the customer has to make the payments regardless of the performance of the project. The ESCO will cover the shortage, but it's a different risk profile. Another difference, in the energy service agreement, the provider owns the measures. If you recall, Jorge Hernandez said, I could take the equipment back. Now, that's not easy to do in a building, but that's the same concept. And third, the provider in this model provides the financing through a mixture of debt and equity. So on the left, the ESA provider is getting capital from investors who are investing, and they may be using their own money as well. They may get debt from investors, and they may use their own equity. And that's what's going on here. And then fourth, the provider, the ESA provider, manages the contractors that are installing the project. And that could be an ESCO, could be a contractor, or whatever. This is a model that's being used in the private sector mainly today in the U.S., and it's sort of the current way that shared savings deals work in the U.S., in the States. So I'm going to move on to the next section where we talk about actual projects in our database, unless there are other questions or comments now.
We're good, Chuck. Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to move on. Okay, so as I said, we have over 6,000 projects in our database. What's important in this picture is to show the data that we're collecting. So the ESCOs give us information on project cost, floor area, total energy savings. They tell us whether the projected savings, they tell us what the guarantee is, and they share with us the results after the project is implemented and installed, and they share with us the actual savings. They report the dollar value of the savings, the type of contract, guaranteed, design build, shared savings, how long the contract is. They list all the measures. And so that's the kind of information we collect in the ESCO database. This is a picture from our database that shows you the investment by state. So there's roughly $17 billion over the last 25 years. ESCOs, there are 2 points I make. One, the top 11 states They're big states, California, New York, Pennsylvania, Texas, Florida. They account for about 60% of the ESCO project investment in our database. And we think that the database is typical of the whole industry. So our database contains roughly 20% of the projects for the entire industry.
Let me make a group question, Chuck, if you don't mind, really quick. So Jorge, if we look into our levels of investments in Puerto Rico, are you going to say between 1 and 50, 50 and 150 and 150? Where do you think we are?
Well, the potential, if you have the total income of PREPA, let's talk about energy. How much is the annual income of PREPA? $5 billion, $6 billion. We can cut that by half in a house, in any manufacturing. That means that when you multiply that for 2 or 3, there are a potential investment in Puerto Rico over $6 billion, $10 billion, and many others. Just to the market that we can create in people, in employment, and suppliers, in maintenance. That is renewable energy. The efficiency is renewable energy. So when we're talking about solar, but we can make the way for a lot of employment, a lot of supply, a lot of maintenance to touch the existing buildings. So there it's multiplied by $12 billion that market in Puerto Rico. But how much you can do in a year? Well, with the law that you have, nothing in the government.
Right.
But in the industry, we need more people.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
To make volume, but in the state you have a lot of ESCOs.
Yeah.
The federal government is doing. The federal government that is giving you money is doing by ESCO, the efficiencies. And the private sector, New York, is moving to ESCOs,
right?
Even though. But there are a lot of people, there are a lot of dedicated guys in the States that have been working with this for many, many years. Probably for the last 30 years have been a huge market, a lot of talent that is working with to make those $1 billion. But in Puerto Rico, we had to grow that thing.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
So in our database, we have 30 to 40 companies that have invested that report. So just to give you a sense of scale, and this has been going on for 20, 25 years. So we also show investments per person. And you can see the states that invest a lot in performance contracting. And you can see that in the Northeast, you have New York and Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia. And in the U.S., oftentimes the states that are highest also have large federal budgets, military facilities, because the ESCO market, maybe 20% of the U.S. ESCO market is federal projects. So places that have military bases, like in Texas and Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, they have lots of ESCO activity. But this is just, the point is that every state in the U.S. has an ESCO business of varying sizes. Okay, I'm going to move on to installed measures, the kinds of measures that are installed and what kind of costs. So this is a picture of the kinds of measures that are installed in ESCO projects and the frequency. What percentage of projects have these measures? So for example, over 80% of all projects have lighting measures. Controls, maybe 60 to 70% of projects have HVAC controls. You look at chillers, 30%, 40% of projects install new chillers. 40% install new boilers. You can see that water conservation is being done by 20, 30% of the projects. And you also see some differences across sectors. In general, the private sector is installing fewer measures and less frequently than what you see in MUSH. The MUSH market is municipal governments, state and local government, universities, healthcare, schools, hospitals. So that's an acronym for institutional customers. But it's important to show this picture because ESCO projects are pretty comprehensive. They oftentimes are more comprehensive than what you see in a utility energy efficiency program. Customers are investing more. So this is a chart that's a complicated chart. It shows the results by market sector, federal government, hospitals, schools, state and local government buildings, private sector, and it shows it over 5 time periods. Our data goes back a long way. And the point of this is to show you that over time, ESCO customers are installing more measures in their buildings, an average of about 3 or 4 measures to about 8 in the last historical period that we have. And you can see in some markets, like schools and local government, that the number of measures have doubled and tripled over the last 20 years. And what this reflects is the fact that customers want deeper, they want more savings, they're doing capital renovation and replacement, new boilers, new chillers, new roofs, and they're using the performance contracting as the vehicle to finance that kind of stuff. So this is a chart that shows you, again, 5 time vintages, 6 market sectors, but it shows you dollars per square foot. How much are people investing? And what you see over time is that the investment levels per sort of floor area of a facility is increasing in all the markets. And the investment levels range from about $4.50 a square foot in the private sector on the lower left to about $10 a square foot in the federal government, and $6, $7, $8 a square foot in state and local government buildings. And what you'll see from these results is we have investments going up, number of measures going up, and we're going to see what happens to savings. And then I'll show you what happens to payback times. So this is another complicated chart, but what we do in the database is we categorize each project as a certain kind of project. So some are simple, lighting only, you're just doing lighting measures. But oftentimes what happens is a customer will do a major HVAC equipment replacement, boilers, chillers, cooling towers. They also do lighting. But because they're doing that HVAC investment, they're spending more money. Similarly, we have some customers that are just doing HVAC measures and controls, and they're doing lighting. So we call that minor HVAC. And then some people are doing water conservation, and then some people are they include non-energy measures in the project. They're putting on a new roof. They're doing asbestos abatement. They're doing measures that save energy, but they're also doing non-energy measures that you wouldn't expect to save any energy. And we treat those separately because they're spending some of the money on measures that will not save energy, but it's part of the deal. And we would expect their payback times to be longer. But it's an example of a school that needs a new roof, needs a new boiler. The only way they can do this, they have no capital budget, is to do a performance contract. So you'll see these results in the next couple slides. Now this is another sort of complicated slide, but there's a couple of themes. The first theme is that the red, the lighting only stuff, you can see that it was very popular in the beginning of the industry. So 30% of the private sector projects did lighting only in the 90s. In the schools market, state and local governments, 25% of the projects were lighting only. But over time, as the customers got more comfortable with ESCOs, as they understood performance contracting, the mix has started to change. So now you see many more major HVAC projects, and you see relatively few lighting only projects today in every market segment. And you also see that on-site generation is becoming more popular. And it's, for example, in the private sector, it's 30% of the projects are doing on-site generation. In the university and college market, 25%. So this shows you how the markets have evolved as the customers have different needs, and how the performance contracting is a pretty flexible vehicle. You got to have savings, you got to have a long-term contract, got to have financing, but it can accommodate different technical efficiency and on-site generation opportunities.
Hey, Chuck, this is PJ Wilson. Could I just ask? I'm with the Solar and Storage Association here locally, and I love the ESCO model. I didn't realize the on-site generation component. Are you talking about actual on-site solar, or would this kind of always be more CHP? Or can you say a little bit more about the on-site generation?
Sure, it's a great question. In the early days, before PV costs went down, a lot of it was sort of CHP projects, and sometimes it was even backup generation. The ESCOs don't tell us in the database. We can't always tell if it's backup generation or total facility. In more recent years, it's definitely a combination of on-site solar PV plus, some CHP or backup generation. But I will say this, that the ESCOs have not, in relative terms, have not been that successful. In the U.S., there are other providers that are mainly providing on-site solar. The ESCOs have tried to partner with them, and in some cases they've been successful. But other cases, no. The other companies can oftentimes be cheaper, lower cost than the ESCOs in this market. So it's a mixed bag. And then the other thing I wanted to highlight in this picture was the fact of how many projects have non-energy measures included them. So if you look, you'll see that in schools, roughly 30-40% of the projects have some type of non-energy measure, a new roof, asbestos abatement, and so on. And it's a big part of the deals.
I have a question on the item that
Sure.
you said that some of the components of the projects are non-energy related, and that just made me think we have a chronic public transportation shortage in Puerto Rico. So I don't know whether the examples that you looked at from the states actually have some kind of transportation component. It might have some energy impact. I mean, we do have a rail line that doesn't go very far, but if you include some component to ease any kind of connection from the facility to the rail line, that would have some overall energy savings, even if it's not within the project itself. But do you have any examples of what non-energy activities were included in the projects?
Sure. In the U.S., it's a narrower definition. It really relates to the facility. And so the classic one is new roofs, and the second one is asbestos abatement, and even sometimes earthquake measures, earthquake-related things are structural. But typically that doesn't include transportation kind of things.
How about something like putting solar panels on your parking lot, so that you
Yes,
can actually have
that would
heat
be included.
generating? Okay, so
If your parking lot is metered as part of the facility, like that's typical in the U.S. in our schools. So we have schools, like many of the schools in California have solar PV in the parking lot, and it's connected to the utility meter at the school, and it works. Okay. People always ask me in an ESCO project, how much money is being spent on lighting, how much is being spent on major HVAC, how much is minor, and so on. So we used our eProject Builder database, which has measure level cost information and savings, to give a rough ballpark of where the dollars are going over time in typical ESCO projects. And what you see basically is, roughly 15-20% of the dollars are being spent on lighting. Oftentimes 40-50% are being spent on HVAC-related measures. And we see a small amount of money being spent on non-energy measures over time and on-site generation. So this is just illustrative. It comes from 500 projects out of 6,000. So it's not, I won't claim that it's totally representative of the whole market, but it gives you a feel for those projects where we know what's being spent on measures, what the distribution looks like. Now, this is actually an important slide. We also ask ESCOs to tell us whether they're getting funding from a utility rebate program. And if so, how much? And what fraction of the project cost it represents. This slide shows you the share of projects that are telling us, yeah, in my project, we used rebate dollars. And 2 points I would make. One, when the ESCO business first started out, it was very common for ESCOs to use utility rebate dollars. And it leveraged the project, and it helped the project. You can see in the private sector, 75% of projects in the 90s took rebates, 50% in the public markets. As the ESCO industry has grown, as ESCOs have become, as also the utility incentives sometimes are not as large or not as easy to use, the share of projects using them has declined. So now we're about 25-30% of the projects use incentives. And my point is that the ESCO utility efficiency programs can complement performance contracting. They are not opposed to each other. They can be very complementary, and they can and when you're growing an ESCO industry, it can be a big help to have ratepayer funded efficiency programs that are part of the package. Okay, any questions on that section? Because I'm going to turn to savings. So this is a chart that shows you the percentage savings for different types of retrofit strategies. And in this chart, I'm showing you the average, the typical savings level, and I'm also showing you those little bars that go up and down. That's called the interquartile range. What that means is it's the top 75% and the bottom 25%. So what I'm showing you in that little line graph is the middle 50% of projects. So for example, in lighting, what we see in the public sector is average savings are 40% of baseline, and the top 25 percentile is about 50%, and the bottom 25 percentile is at about 30%. And this gives you a feel for, now this is not always utility bills, because the baseline is sometimes just what's being used in the end use, or what they think is being used in lighting. What you see though here is that HVAC projects typically save about 25% of baseline use. Lighting saves more, but the baseline is it's a smaller baseline. And oftentimes lighting savings are using stipulated savings, or using engineering estimates of you're reducing the kW wattage from CFLs to LEDs and so on. This next chart shows you those savings as a percentage of the utility bill. So some ESCOs give us the whole utility bill and they say, this is what my project saved. The sample sizes are smaller, but what you see is that the median savings are about 15 to 20% in all market segments. And and sometimes you see a wide range, oftentimes when we have very small samples of projects. But in relative terms, these projects are pretty comprehensive. Now, they may not be getting the savings that Jorge Hernandez showed you this morning, but I'm showing you projects over a 20-year period. And oftentimes they've done things before, they've gone back. So there may not be as much low-hanging fruit as you might see in some facilities in Puerto Rico. Now this is, again, a little bit of a complicated chart, but it shows you trends over time. So it has you the market segments, and it shows you the 5 vintages. And what we're showing, the point is this, is that we see from earlier slides that costs are increasing. Well, what's happened to savings? Well, generally, savings are sort of flat. People are having to spend more money to get these 15, 20% savings. And what that translates to is we're going to see longer payback periods. It's also symptomatic of a more mature market. And this chart shows you the same kind of information, but it says the dollar value of savings. So if you think about it, if you're spending $4 a square foot and you save $50 a square foot, that's roughly about an 8-year payback time. So that's how we use this information. People always ask us, how much can you save per square foot? And this gives you the data at a pretty high level about what we observe. Now, again, the savings per square foot in dollar terms depend on the rates. So I would expect these numbers to be higher in Puerto Rico, given that you're paying 22, 23 cents a kilowatt hour. That's a fair amount higher than in most states in the U.S. So the dollar value of savings could very well be higher in Puerto Rico than what you'd see in some of these same U.S. buildings. Is there a question or not?
No, we're good, Chuck. We're good.
Okay, so this chart shows you the share of savings from energy and non-energy by time period, by market sector. And what we're showing again is how how important non-energy savings are to some of these projects. It's a big part of the deal. So ESCOs are claiming savings in O&M. They're saving, in some cases, they're claiming deferred capital costs. So in schools projects, that can be 30 to 40% of the savings. In state and local government buildings, it can be 20% of the savings. In the private sector, you don't see it for the most part because customers don't want to take credit for that. They're not sure, they're not doing it because they have their own capital budgets or because it's not part of the deal. But it's important to understand that in a performance contract, increasingly you see bill savings on utility bills and you see other kinds of savings that are reducing costs to the facility. Now, they're sometimes hard to measure, and that's one of the challenges, but that's part of the deal. Now, this is an interesting chart because it shows you the trends in guaranteed versus actual savings over time. So one of the questions you get is, well, how often do ESCOs succeed? How when you give a savings guarantee, are ESCOs being conservative? Does the actual performance better than that? And what you see is that roughly 30, 40% of the projects, the actual savings are higher than the guarantee because ESCOs are conservative. They want to make sure that they meet the guarantee because if they don't, they have to make up the difference. On the other hand, on the bottom in the blue, you see that roughly 10, 15, 20% of the projects may not meet the guarantee. And in those cases, the ESCO's got to go back or they either have to make payments to help make the debt service or they have to go back and do more to help out. And so that's sort of what this shows that the ESCOs in general have been getting better at predicting and getting closer to what the guarantee and the actual savings are. Payback times. So this is a sort of a simple metric that the customers will look at may be important to them, and you calculate it by dividing project investment costs. And we back out subsidies and incentives and financing costs, and we divide that by the monetary savings, the dollar value of savings. And sometimes it's useful to compare that to how long the contracts are. So this chart is an important chart. It shows you the trends in payback time over time in the 6 market sectors. And what you can see, given that costs are going up, savings are pretty flat, payback times are increasing in most market sectors. So, for example, you can see in the federal government, we started out at about 5 years, and today we're at about 10, 12, or 13 years payback time. And that's because federal customers are putting in new chillers, new boilers, on-site generation. They're not just doing lighting. They're doing a lot more.
So really quick question,
You see the
Chuck.
same-
Yeah. So really quick question, Chuck. So when you're doing these payback times, what is the kilowatt hour value that you're using?
and when we do the payback time calculation, we use we have a decision hierarchy. If we have data on actual savings, that's what we use. If we don't have data on actual savings, we use the guarantee. That's what we do.
So you think that for Puerto Rico, due to the price of the kilowatt hour, that may be a little bit smaller?
Again, the savings are a function of the technical opportunity. So if buildings in Puerto Rico are not using much energy, then you may not be able to save that much.
Yeah, but I'm just so.
But on the other hand, you're paying a lot. So the dollar value of the savings may compensate for the fact that, you may save 10% in buildings in Puerto Rico, but you're paying double. So the payback times might very well look like this. And Jorge Hernandez showed you projects where the payback time is more attractive than this, because I would argue that he's doing private sector buildings and the payback times are less. And he's doing buildings it's relatively newer in the process. The market is less mature, so he's finding good projects. And the customers demand those kind of paybacks.
Yeah, but in Puerto Rico, because the cost of energy, if you do the same model of a building in the state and Puerto Rico, we are saving the same if we implement the same measurements on both buildings. And we are saving the same energy or water, because the toilet, the cooling towers, the upgrade that we are doing, we are going to optimize with the same technology. Let's say that it will consume the LED of 150 watt lumens per watt here than the state. But what about the cost? So those paybacks in Puerto Rico, if you do the investment and you do the engineering and by yourself you run the energy program, payback normally is half or 1/3 of the cost in the state, because the construction cost in Puerto Rico, the engineering, the labor is far cheaper than the state. The technologies, we have the import costs and taxes to bring it, but relative engineering is cheaper, and you can implement and place very very good by implementing this project. So payback of 2 years. Well, 5 years or less in any facility is a very good deal. And talking about 1 year, 2 year, months, that is typically that we can get in HVAC, lighting, water. Mm-hmm. So it's very, very attractive. And the thing is that if Puerto Rico don't look as a business model to include the efficiency as part of your business, to doing business in Puerto Rico, you don't know what talking about to do business in Puerto Rico. Right. That is why many multinational companies having those programs. But what about the rest of the people? What about the government? What about the how we start helping them to live in Puerto Rico, to operate in Puerto Rico, if they're trying to compete with the cost of the state? And most of those private in the state, in industry, commercial, are not doing saving. Those are federal government, state, healthcare, private. But where is the private sector there? Mm-hmm. The thing is that they have cheaper costs, and we need to put the island as the efficiency island. So in order to compete with the electricity, the utility cost, has to be, to survive in this area, make business, makes sense. The payback are there. The thing is the structure.
Yeah, great, thanks. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to move along in the interest of time, if that's okay.
Please.
So the next section, the short section, just talks about how big this industry is and where it works in the States. So this is a picture that shows you ESCO annual revenues over the last 25 years. This is based on our surveys of ESCO CEOs. The bottom line is, as of about 2014, the industry was about $5.3 billion in annual revenues. And the ESCOs give us a forecast of what they think it's going to be in 2 or 3 years, and they're forecasting growth of about 10 to 15% a year and about $7.6 billion. We're now doing our next survey, and we'll see how it actually turned out, and we'll see if the industry actually grew that much in the U.S. The ESCOs tend to be optimistic. You can see that the actual numbers in 2011 and 14 were lower than what they told us 3 years before. This is an important slide because it shows you the market segments and the revenues. So you can see that state and local government's about 25%, schools are 23%, federal government about 20%, universities and college about 10%, healthcare about 6%, and the private sector only 8% in the U.S. Performance contracting is not the dominant approach to do efficiency in the commercial industrial market. It's a niche, basically. This chart shows you company the revenues by size of company. You know, is this market dominated by big companies, or do small companies have an important role to play? And we define companies by the size of their annual revenue. So, like, you know, big companies, Johnson Controls, Honeywell, Trane, and there are lots of small companies in this business. And what you can see is that in the private sector markets, commercial industrial, the small companies have a big role, 30%. But in the federal market, it's tougher to compete. The bigger companies tend to dominate. And roughly, you'll see in this industry about the top 10 companies, 10 to 12 companies, account for about 70%, 75% of the revenues. But there's a role, an important role for smaller companies still. I'm going to skip this one. There was a question earlier about repeat business and do customers do it all at once or whatever. So we asked ESCOs, as of 2014, the last time we did the survey, how much of your revenues come from new customers and how much of it comes from repeat business? And you can see from this chart, for example, in schools, that roughly about 60% comes from new customers, but 40% comes from existing customers. And you can see that, you know, existing customers account for about 50% in the federal market, in the higher education market, and healthcare. And in the private sector, you know, repeat business is about 60%. New customers about 40% of the revenues. So it's really clear that the ESCOs really depend on repeat business from customers who are satisfied, and they use that, and they go back and they go deeper, and they do other measures. So this is a summary. Project investment levels and dollar savings are increasing over time. Investment levels have gone up from 100% to 500% compared to the 1990s. The dollar savings have increased 50 to 70% over time. And payback times are getting longer. And our contract lengths are getting longer too. And the source of dollar savings has evolved somewhat. So you now see more examples of non-energy benefits, particularly in the schools market. But you also said that given in the States, natural gas prices have gone down. And that reduces the dollar value of savings or projects that depend on they're using gas. And we also see that, you know, customer bills are a combination of energy charges and demand charges. And over time, we see more of the savings coming from reductions in demand charges because the utilities are relying on them more in the states. Payback times are going up, average 7 to 13 years over the last 30 years. And you can also see that projects are changing. They're becoming more complex, more comprehensive. The average number of measures have doubled typically. And we see more examples of capital-intensive measures such as on-site generation, major HVAC investments, and some non-energy investments. This chart shows you the industry revenues. And then over 2/3 of the ESCO projects use performance contracting. And over 80% of the projects meet or exceed the savings guarantee. So at a high level, ESCO projects are becoming more complex. They involve a comprehensive mix of capital-intensive measures. They rely less often on utility program incentives. And they're reporting increasing dollar savings levels, especially non-energy savings. So I have one more slide. And again, a lot of words. I talked to Jorge Camacho, and he asked me to sort of maybe kick off a discussion or sort of summarize. There's lots of strategies that you can use for efficiency. Ratepayer-funded programs, performance contracting, building codes, low-income weatherization, financing. Now, this is not an exclusive list, but it's a pretty good list. And you can look at these strategies across several dimensions. Market size and scope, the ability to reduce barriers that we observe, and the ability to expand and ramp up and scale. So this slide is Chuck's personal opinion. And just take it for what it's worth. Just my judgment. In the best ratepayer-funded programs, they cover all market segments, both new and existing. In performance contracting, at least in the States, it's primarily non-residential, primarily public buildings with creditworthy parties. Clearly, building codes focus on new construction, and low-income focuses on low-income residential. And financing tends to be, in the U.S., most financing programs tend to be, we get existing residential, commercial, industrial, and public facilities. So market scope and size can be broader with ratepayer-funded efficiency programs. In terms of barriers, a really good ratepayer-funded program, and that's a question, it can tackle many of the barriers that customers face. Information barriers, first cost, technical risk concerns, working with good companies. If you offer a portfolio of programs, over that whole portfolio, you may be able to you're actually attacking those barriers. Some of the other strategies tend to be more focused. So, for example, performance contracting really addresses first cost barriers because the customer doesn't have to pay for the costs up front, and they give you access to capital and low-cost capital, and they address technical risk. Building codes address information barriers and split incentives. Low-income weatherization typically addresses the financial barriers faced by low-income customers. And financing programs tend to try to give access to capital and address those kinds of risks that customers face in accessing low-cost capital. In terms of the ability to ramp up and scale, my judgment, if you have a good, effective administrator, a good policy framework, and you have a good business model for your administrator, then you have a solid ability to expand and ramp up and scale, assuming that you can deal with, those issues. The ESCO industry takes a relatively long time to ramp up and scale because you have to overcome some pretty significant institutional and technical barriers. You've got to have laws that allow you to sign multi-year contracts. You've got to have banks who are comfortable loaning on performance contracts. You need trained engineers to do complex projects. You have to have customers that are willing to take those risks. We have examples of a mature ESCO industry in the U.S., done pretty well over 30 years, but it's taken a while. Building codes, it really depends on the code level, contractor training and enforcement, the amount of activity in new construction and renovation. If you live in a society that's not building a lot, well, then codes are not going to get you very much. In contrast, I expect in Puerto Rico, you're going to be doing lots of construction. And so you have the ability to, building codes can be quite important in Puerto Rico, assuming that you have strong codes, that you can enforce them, and so on. Low-income weatherization. You can ramp up low-income programs fairly rapidly if you've got adequate funding. That's a big if. You got to have a good administrator, and you have to have a good contractor infrastructure that knows what to do in those buildings. Financing, again, it takes a relatively long time to ramp up financing programs, at least in the States. And I can show you examples of financing programs that have been around for 10, 15 years and how they've ramped up. So that's my sort of high-level summary of these strategies. I think they are complementary. They are not replacements for each other. If you have very aggressive goals in Puerto Rico, you may need all of this stuff. And how you sequence it, that's a judgment call.
This is great, Chuck. I mean, do you mind just being there for 1 second on the table? So we got 5 different strategies.
1 second. I was
Oh, please go ahead.
The slides, they just show you references and resources if you want to go deeper, and information on contacts. So now I'll go back.
No, this is great. So we got 5 different strategies, right? We had Arquitecto Abruña talk to us about building codes. I think you mentioned something very interesting, Chuck. And by the way, we're gonna put this on the MS Teams because we want to get feedback. So you mentioned the enforcement part. Have you seen any jurisdiction? Enforcement is gonna be challenging here. Not that it's not gonna get better, but right now maybe challenging. So instead of enforcement of the codes, have you seen some kind of approach where it's an incentive, so they incentivize instead of enforce?
That's a great question. Enforcement is a big problem in some states in the U.S. Building code inspectors in the U.S. have lots of things that they worry about, fire, safety, and so on. And energy efficiency is a small part of what they care about. We have examples in the U.S. of utility new construction programs that provide incentives for the utility to verify that the codes are working. So in California, Massachusetts, you will see examples of new construction programs where the utilities hire a contractor or inspectors, or they train inspectors to improve the enforcement of building codes that exist. So we do see it. So we have both examples of carrots and sticks, but carrots definitely work. And some people don't like those programs because they say, look, why should we pay the utility to enforce codes that should be done already? But oftentimes, we have evaluations that show that it works. And in some places, it can be quite helpful. I give you an example. Nevada, very hot climate, lots of cooling loads, history of poor construction practices. And there the utility has a very successful new construction program that works with builders to improve code compliance, argue for stronger codes, and they have proven that it works. But it takes time to do those programs.
Chuck, I could give another example too. In Missouri, I don't think we included this, but I know in one of the Southwest states, was it Arizona? I think they included as counting towards their compliance with their energy efficiency standard there. They gave them, 30%, I think, credit, the utility towards efforts that they did to help with energy efficiency building code. compliant. So I wonder, outside the box things, that don't cost any money. I wonder if the Energy Bureau here could get involved in code compliance in a revenue neutral kind of way.
So you're right. In the world of leads and those kind of things, there are actually examples of utilities that partner with different types of voluntary codes or voluntary approaches that are being used to improve efficiency in buildings. So that could be part of the design of those kind of programs.
This is great, Chuck. Thank you so much. I mean, having these 5 strategies on one page, I think it does exactly what we need to be pursuing, which is to consider these strategies so we can be able to contemplate all these options. I believe PJ mentioned the following. So it's a little different in Puerto Rico because it's truly up to the Bureau to identify the EE programs that we're going to try to move in order to meet the mandate of 30% by 2040. Thank you so much, Chuck. You have been for the continued support. We look forward to continuing the engagement. Very gentle. Thank you very much, Chuck.
Thank you. I hope it was helpful.
Absolutely. Have a good one, Chuck.
Yeah.
So what we're gonna do now, guys, we're gonna go ahead and have a 15 minutes. So we're gonna come back at 4:05. We do the final stretch and we are in our merry way home. So 15 minutes. Si vamos a coger un break de 15 minutos. Si quieren café en el nivel plaza, hay café. Volvemos a las 4:05 para terminar entonces el taller. Gracias. podemos empezar a acomodar para empezar la última sesión. So we are in the final stretch, guys. Y algo que vamos a hacer es, yo creo que la diapositiva que Chuck hizo con las cinco diferentes estrategias, la vamos a poner en MS Teams. Creo que es una página, it goes right to the point, para entonces tener su insumo, ¿no? Quizás hay unas estrategias que le podrían convenir a los municipios que se deberían explorar, quizás que no se han explorado. Nos hemos dado cuenta que sí, que hay unas barreras, que hay unas barreras que se tienen que atender, sí, porque tenemos que fomentar estos programas pues, para llegar a las metas que ya la política pública energética ha identificado. En este momento vamos a tener a Wally Nixon. Wally Nixon está con la Comisión de Energía de Arkansas y ellos han tenido unos programas de eficiencia energética que han sido muy... que han tenido le han tomado mucha ventaja y queremos aprender de lo que ellos han visto allí en Arkansas y los programas que se pueden implementar rápidamente, los que se llaman Quick Start. Lo que voy a hacer en este momento, le voy a dar la palabra a Wally y como hicimos con Chuck, esto es un conversatorio, así que lo pueden interrumpir en cualquier momento. So Wally, I'm going to pass the word to you. Thank you very much, and just introduce yourself, and so the group can hear a little bit of your background also. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Jorge. I am sitting at my desk here in Little Rock. I'm getting an echo back from this, but perhaps we can just work with that. I have been working in this field for 45 years, and I'll give you a little background. I'm a lawyer. I work as one of the commissioner's attorneys, advisors here at the Arkansas Commission. And in 1975, I actually worked in the Attorney General's office and began working on energy efficiency matters. And it was during this time that then soon to become Governor Bill Clinton came into office. And he asked me the fall of '76, right before he took office, to write a bill for the legislature. I did, and it was drafted and passed January of 1977. It was called the Arkansas Energy Conservation Endorsement Act. And that act authorized the Public Service Commission to implement and require utilities to provide energy efficiency programs. That law sat on the books for 29 years until 2006. I guess Jorge, if you've got my slides up, it would be the very first slide.
Yeah, that's where we are right now.
And it shows that in 2006, there was an energy efficiency rulemaking and collaborative process, perhaps similar to what you all are engaged in now, that led to the implementation of what we began with, which was our program. Those were defined fairly early on as programs that elsewhere and economical without having to undergo any kind of cost-effectiveness test on the front end. So in that first year of 2006, we engaged in collaborative activities with the facilitator provided by the Regulatory Assistance Project to come up with proposals for rules for conservation and energy efficiency. And those rules were promulgated by the Commission in February of 2007, with the quick start phase ultimately beginning later in that year in the fall of 2007. The law provided for direct cost recovery contemporaneously with the implementation of programs that the utilities began to offer. It took a while for those to actually ramp up, and in 2010, the quick start phase was actually implemented between 2007 and in 2010, the Commission adopted some rules and rulemaking provisions, adopting performance incentives for utility shareholders, and recovery of lost contributions to fixed costs, sometimes called lost revenues. Also orders adopting evaluation measurement verification, creating an independent evaluation monitor to oversee the EM&D process immediately, and adopting the SARP, a standardized annual reporting packet or process for utilities to report what they had achieved. So between 2012 and 2017, we engaged in the comprehensive phase. Programs began to be cost-effectively and tested during that implementation. So we are now, this slide's a little bit dated, we're now in the next 3-year cycle, 2020 to 2022. During that period from 2013 until now, we've enhanced the programming, done a potential study, and improved weatherization. So next slide, please. This shows some of what has been achieved in the year program year 2018. That's the most recent year we have reporting on. Our reports come in May. And the total utility spending, we have 4 electric investor-owned utilities and 3 natural gas utilities. This is the total for all of the 7 utilities, $76 million spent on energy efficiency. Under the total resource cost test, the value of those is calculated to be $125 million for a TRC value of 1.865. So the question is, where did all that come from and where did it go? What was done with those funds that were spent to gain those benefits of energy efficiency? What was achieved was that particular year, those 282,000 megawatt hours were saved by the electric utility, roughly the amount that would serve 26,000 homes. We're a hot, humid climate, probably much like you all, but we do have cold winters. It was about 20 degrees this morning. But the average usage in Arkansas is about 1,000 kilowatt hours a month, so we use that figure, and that's how we came up with the equivalent of homes. What also comes out of the energy efficiency programs is demand reduction on the electric side, which you can't really avoid if you do things like change out HVAC equipment or do load management, smart thermostats or something like that. You're going to get some demand reduction, and that was added up among the 4 electric utilities to 106 megawatts. Next slide shows you, you can put that one up. It's hard to read, but it's basically showing for one of our utilities, Southwestern Electric Power Company. For 2015, it's just an example of what you might find in our annual reporting. It shows how the total cost of the program they implemented were calculated for each of the programs they did, like residential lighting, residential star appliances, weatherization program, various things, how much they spent, the total cost, how much benefits were received, what the total net benefits were, and that TRC value is shown there. So that can be found for any of our utilities. Let's move on to the next slide. This one is, get mine to come up. Having difficulties seeing my own slides.
Wally, can you hear me? Can you hear me, Wally?
Yes, I can hear you.
If there is a way, I think you may be in speakerphone. If there is a way you can pick up, you sound a little bit far away. There's a way you could pick up the phone better. I think that would work a little better.
Okay, I'll try that. Is this better?
Fantastic. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm, hold on a second. I think I've cured my problem. Okay. So, I'm on this slide, number 5, rather.
Yeah.
So how do we know these cost-saving numbers? I think the point of this slide is to show that we plan on the front end for a review of what the cost-effectiveness estimates of the utilities are going to be before the programs are implemented. And then we evaluate them looking backward. Every utility is required to engage a third-party independent evaluation company. They all do that. Sometimes they use the same ones. And they engage in annual tracking and reporting and evaluation of the actual conditions that have been achieved by the utilities. These are some of the principles of the evaluation. The EM&V cost amounts to roughly 5% of the total program cost for the utilities as a whole. And we then have, as I mentioned earlier, this IEM, Independent Evaluation Monitor. The Commission insisted on this second level of evaluation, EM&V, by engaging an independent evaluation monitor, Dr. Catherine Johnson of Baltimore, who reports to the Commission every year. She evaluates the evaluators' reports that they do for the utilities. So in essence, what we have is the utilities make a plan of what they plan to save in energy, and then they themselves gauge what they achieved, and they turn that over to their own evaluators to look at it. And the evaluators of the utilities make a report to them, sometimes raising what the utility said they achieved, sometimes lowering it a little bit. It's usually pretty close. And then the IEM takes a look at all of these evaluation reports of the utilities and comes up with an annual report on that. And those are available. All of this is available on our website quite easily to look at for every year. The next slide shows some other tools that we use for energy efficiency that were begun within the first 3 years. Essentially, it took us a little while to get rules on EM&V, but we had a rulemaking on that. And we adopted a technical reference manual, or I don't say adopted, we borrowed one from Texas to start with to do deemed savings on engineering estimates of savings for different appliances and products. It's now over 800 pages in length. It's in version 8.1. It has protocols for determining things like spillover effects and leakage and behavioral programs, custom industrial programs. And so that's all also available on our website very easily. Then the annual EM&V reports come in May, and they show the impact of the programs and also the process that's used. So some examples, they evaluate builds after insulating 1,000 homes, or study the hours of operation for commercial lighting. And over this time, I think we've built up pretty good data for this part of the Southeast U.S. So the next slide, just some subtleties here that we would point out that some states, in some states, the legislature sets the target for utilities to achieve. This whole set of slides is sort of aiming to discuss how we got to setting targets for what the utilities should do. And that in some of those states, the Commission's job is just to implement what the legislature's decided. In our case, we had the statute that was passed in 1975, which authorized the Commission to require utilities to do these programs as an essential utility service. And so the Commission developed its own rationale and method and linked achievement to the utilities performance incentive formula that we developed in 2010 and 2011. By the time we got to that point, we were able to provide some incentives for the utilities, and that got them moving, but it was tied to having a target for energy savings. Technically, the rules and order of the Commission adopting the cost recovery and incentives and loss contribution to fixed costs is aimed at requiring utilities to implement the maximum cost-effective energy efficiency, not necessarily the target. And I must say that the target, which we'll talk about the specifics of that and how we got to where we are in a moment, the target is not a mandate that they must achieve, but they are incentivized to do it. It also does not have a penalty for failure to do it. Some states have developed penalties. We did not do that. So the target is essentially a default alternative that makes everybody's life easier, because you don't really have to prove that maximum amount. It's hard to prove that than to prove what the maximum amount of achievable energy efficiency is. The next slide shows some more subtleties. It technically requires utilities to file a cost-effective plan to meet the target. And so they do that. They come up with their planned achievement of energy savings is going to be. They file a 3-year plan. once that is approved, they are able to go forward for the next 3 years. So we are now in the first year of the 3-year planning cycle, 2020 to 2022.
Wally, I think we
That
have
was
a
approved.
question in the room.
Yeah,
Yes.
the question I have is that the Puerto Rico, the law that was set had a target of like 30% by 2040. And one of the challenges is that nobody's really sure how the legislature got to that target. I think they just came up with some number that wasn't too high or too low, and that's what they ran with. And I think that one of the challenges for the Bureau and for folks who are interested in the topic is that there were no real benchmarks of how to get there. And I think there is a soft target of 2025. But what's your experience with the legislature in Arkansas, and how did they reach the target, and how close were they in what was feasible to achieve?
Okay, I think I understand your point. Yeah, I'm not sure I heard every bit of that. Can you clarify a little bit? The legislative target is what, 20?
It's 30
over 20 years?
Yeah, 30% of all energy produced has to be from renewables by 2040.
Okay, so in 20 years, 30% by 20 years. So that would be 1.5% a year.
There's no yearly target.
That has not been said, Wally. That's one of the things that the Bureau has to do, and that's what we're here to see what will make sense.
Okay. Yeah, I think I can speak to that. Since we started with the quick start programs that were defined as programs that had worked elsewhere, when we got to the point of setting targets in 2010, we started at 0.25% of kilowatt hour sales of the utility per year. The next year it went to 0.5, and then the next year to 0.75, then to 0.9, 0.1, and then I guess leading up to this cycle that we're in, the Commission moved it up to 1.2% each year. So it will remain at 1.2% for the next 3 years, this year and the next 2. And, you know, as you will see as I go through this, the utilities have overachieved against those targets nearly every year. They outperform what the target is, which tells us that the target may not be high enough. So we just phased into it, starting slow, and that's how we've gotten to where we are. I think you can find by looking around the country that some states are quite a bit above that, 2 or even 3%, maybe in New England. Some of the states have that, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, I don't remember. But that's where we are. And we are a very low-cost state, so we don't have high avoided costs to target against, and I expect you do, given the generation which you have. We have nuclear and gas and increasingly solar now, and so we're in coal as well, which will be phasing out.
Jess,
So,
yeah, we do have high cost, especially when we got pickers that will come online pretty often, and those are pretty high cost.
yeah, I would think a higher cost would mean you'd have an easier time achieving savings. Our rates are low. Let's see where we are. I guess I'm looking at slide 12. Does that fit with where you are?
It is now.
Okay, on this, why did we set a target? We wanted a yardstick for performance, and it was tied to the incentives. And the incentives are not a right. They're not tied to the earnings on some phantom plant, but they're a management mechanism. And they're structured to incentivize creation of life cycle ratepayer value, those net benefits that you saw on that earlier slide, at least cost, and that's a very common metric among energy efficiency states. And our incentive mechanism, which if you want more details on it, I can point you to how it's designed, but we got help from Synapse in preparing that, and it seemed like I've heard that you may be in touch with them or working with RAP, but the incentive starts at 80% of target. In other words, if a utility achieves 80% of the target, they can begin to earn some incentives, and it sort of linearly goes up as the more they achieve, and it is capped. It is capped at a percentage of the total budget for that year. The incentive cannot exceed 6%, as I recall, or maybe 8%. I don't remember specifically, of the total budget of that year. So it's not open-ended. And that's probably a good idea to do that, although to a certain extent, I wonder sometimes if the programs are so effective and cost-effective and the incentives are being earned, why we don't have the utilities coming in asking us to do more of them and to raise their budgets and do it. But the budgets are theirs to come in with, and they've become fairly level in the last two cycles. The target could have been set at a higher or lower level than we did, but as I described there, you'll see it went from 0.25 up to where it is now. So slide 13.
Hey, Wally. This is PJ Wilson. I'm from the great state of Missouri. Your neighbor there. We worked on all these things over the course of the last 10 years. I don't know.
Your John Rogers used to work with us.
Yep. John Rogers was a key staffer at the commission there. He was awesome at putting together the rule making for this whole process. I think RAP helped us with that actually as well. So my question on the last slide, you were just on coming up with those incentives, and yours kicked in at 80% of, I don't know, Missouri, we might have said 50% or 75%. In Missouri, we figured out all of these things as part of the rulemaking process. So my question to you on this slide here is, in this framework that you're presenting, was it crystallized in the rule for your efficiency law, or in the law itself, or where is that the framework established in Arkansas?
I would say it is established in the orders of the commission that approved the incentive mechanism. And I haven't flagged where that is, I don't believe, but I can provide you with that order of the commission in 2010 that set up and approved the utilities proposal. They came up with this mechanism, and it was tweaked in later years in another docket where we enhanced the EE programs. And at the end of this slide, I think I can point you to the particular docket that was in.
Okay, that's much appreciated. We're trying to figure out in Puerto Rico what models to use, and I think what you're presenting here is definitely worth considering. Lots of elements for us here. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Okay. All right. So we're on slide 13. On this, back to that slide that showed all of those numbers, essentially those costs are locked in basically for the energy efficiency measures that are approved. And we also wanted to point out in these slides that you can't just focus on the energy efficiency cost recovery rider. We have that as part of the overall energy efficiency program. Is every utility has an EECR rider, energy efficiency cost recovery rider. Has to be approved every year, even though they're in a 3-year cycle. They come in every year reporting their results for the previous year, and they are able to tell us in their evaluation reports how much they saved, what their lost contribution to fixed costs would have been, and they were able to recover those simultaneously with program implementation. And then based on how they did with their savings, what their incentive should be. And the incentives are only paid in the year after the achievement. They're not collected in advance. And so it's a point on this other slide that energy efficiency does interact with other parts of a customer's bill. The fuel charge is usually much larger than the energy efficiency rider, and it goes down as the energy savings go up. So those interactivities are important to keep in mind. I might add here, I don't know that I have a slide that talks about this, but you would probably ask, what is the average bill impact on a customer? And it's I would say for our largest utility, Entergy, in recent years, it's been in the range of $4 or $5 a month. And we do have data and another set of materials that I have sent to Jorge that you all can look at that show the results for 2018 and what the EECR figure is. So you take the rate that comes out of the EECR filings every year will be a rate per kilowatt hour, and you multiply that by 1,000 on average, and that'll give you what the amount is for that year. So if it's 4.5 cents, then it would be $4.50. But those EECR things are available every year and reviewed and approved. So let's move on to one other, next slide, 14. I think what we're trying to say here, and if you look at slide 15, you'll see what I'm talking about, that even a low-cost state like Arkansas, and this is impossible to read, but the very far right side, second from the left, is Arkansas, down near the bottom of rates of all the 50 states. Is, I think this came out of EIA, Energy Administration, Information Administration. So our rates are still pretty low. This is a few years back, but they're still very low. And nonetheless, our utilities have achieved quite a bit with these programs. Next slide. This is the one I was talking about that gives you links to different things. I'll just describe these a little bit for you just so you know what's there. The very top line is the website essentially for the commission and its services on, if you want to search a docket by number, go to that top one. And you'll see down in the bottom part there are docket numbers like 06004R. That's the rulemaking. That was the start of things in 06. And orders number 12 and 15 are the fundamental orders approving the rules. The second line, we have the rules actually on the website, and you can click to go there. The technical reference manual is also available. And then you can go to any of these orders that are mentioned here. I think you were asking about the utility performance incentives and EM&V. The orders on that, if you'll look at that docket 08137 in 2010, you'll see orders 14, 15, and 16 deal with those three topics on that line. And then the TRM is there, and the annual reporting packet is there. And then this last one is docket 13002. I believe that is where we will be able to find, if you want me to dig it out for you, the enhancement to the incentive program that was done in some later years after we had already implemented back in 2011 or 12. So the last slide, I think, on my deck here is links to the particular utilities dockets, and you could enter any of those docket numbers on the website and find hundreds of filings over the last 13 years by these companies. Entergy is our largest utility. SWEPCO is an American Electric Power affiliate, OG&E. Empire District doesn't get covered a great deal because it's a very tiny part of the state that is served by it, and it's kind of an outlier. The bottom three are the gas companies, and I know that's not something you all regulate. So those are the basics of this. Now, I had one other thing, Jorge, if you wanted to provide the listeners with the materials I sent you earlier today about independent administration. Was there interest in hearing more about that?
Yes, let's go ahead and do that, Wally. Let me pull that up. Yes, so yeah, if you can,
Okay.
let me give a little bit of context in regards to that. So the independent administration, yeah. So I got a document. I'm gonna pull it up. This is the one that you share with us. So let me bring a little bit of context with the group. So guys, as you know, and I'm gonna go ahead and switch to Spanish very quick. I will come back in English, Wally. Como nosotros sabemos, una de las opciones que el negociado puede considerar para impulsar los programas de energía eficiencia energética es la administración independiente de esos programas. Algunas veces la gente le llama un third party administrator, ¿no? Y eso es, no tienen que hacerlo, pero es algo que pueden contemplar. Ya Wally en Arkansas, ellos contemplaron ese arreglo. Y si es posible, quisiéramos ver qué tipo de experiencias ellos tienen en Arkansas. So Wally, I'm right now. I got the document online on the screen. This is the one that says
Yes.
the Independent Administration of Energy Efficiency Programs. So Wally, if you can share with the group your experience contemplating and evaluating the benefits and the possibility of having this kind of arrangement of Arkansas in Arkansas, and what were your determinations?
Okay. This is probably, I'm not going to read this, but you can read it at your leisure. It's basically some quotations from the order adopting the rules in 2007. But the first part, a couple of things are numbered 1 and 2 are comments from Entergy, which was opposed to the idea of independent administration, and the Attorney General, which was generally in support of the idea. And then at the bottom on the third page, you see the Commission's decision discussing the AG's position and the utilities. And essentially the bottom line of it is the Commission said, we're not going to go down that road right now, but we could later, so we'll leave the option open in the rules. So that's still the way it is. I think it was discussed during the collaborative. There were some parties, at that early stage of the collaborative process in 2006, we did not have the participants in the collaborative that we do today. I was looking back at it at the time, and the Attorney General was probably the most interested in doing the efficiency programs using an independent administrator. The issue hadn't really been talked about much since, but today we have parties like Audubon, National Audubon Society, Sierra Club, and the Arkansas Advanced Energy Association, and solar providers. We have a lot more parties that are active in our collaboratives than we did in those days. But we also, you'll see that the Commission's decision is that because Arkansas has a very dispersed electric and gas infrastructure with rudimentary customer efficiency awareness and diverse markets and modest economic conditions, that was a reason to rely on the utilities to deliver the programs, which is what they wanted to do if they were going to be held responsible for the results. So the Commission decided not to go that route. I know a few states have done it, Vermont, Oregon, and I'm not sure if there are any others, but that was the reason that the Commission decided not to do that. So I could respond if there are any questions about it. It didn't gain a whole lot of discussion during the time, but it was one of many issues that were resolved by this rulemaking.
So what was the bottom line, Wally? What was the decision not to pursue the approach?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Yeah, so what was the reason not to pursue the independent administration approach?
Well, I would say it's because the utilities wanted to do their own programs if they were going to be responsible for the results. And I will say this, that they did proceed immediately to engage third-party implementing contractors to do the work. They're not out there installing light bulbs and putting in efficiency programs. They contract with companies like Clear Result and Converge and others to do the programs that they are still delivering today. And some of the utilities use the same consultants or contractors. The gas and electric companies sometimes work together. The contractors provide the services throughout the state, but the utilities have the choice to use the same ones or to pick their own.
So who identified the programs, Wally? Who says this is a great program from Arkansas? Like everybody's going to have a Nest thermostat. Who identifies those programs?
Who identified what?
Yeah, the kind of measures being implemented. Like somebody will say, okay, everybody having a Nest thermostat, that's a great measure. Let's go ahead for it. And what about a
Okay.
direct load control program? Who makes the determination of what program to pursue?
I would say the utilities came up with the programs. The commission's rules, which you can easily get online, contain some guidelines on what the program should look like. I can give you some idea of that. And so, that's why we started with Quick Start, because we knew there were things that had worked elsewhere. And, but I think there's also within the rules, something that, gives you a little bit of guidance. I'm still trying to find it here right quick. Hold on a second.
But from the rules, from the regs were not prescriptive. It's not like your utility shall implement programmable thermostats. It wasn't that prescriptive. It's just a
It
general.
wasn't, they were more general, yes. I think I can give you some of the language here in just a second.
Yeah. I think in the meantime we
probably
have
ear-
other questions too.
Yes, Wally. I have a question about the utility. In this case, are the utilities in Arkansas have a good history of complying with the commission's orders, that you can rely on them for these programs?
Yes,
as you said, they started implementing kind of quickly.
They've all
So
complied. We have the three, sometimes called the three-legged stool of energy efficiency, which is direct program recovery is assured, contemporaneous with program implementation. So they give us their budget and their plans, and they get to start collecting for it. They are able to collect lost contribution to fixed costs that they estimate, and that's trued up at the end of the year. And then if they achieve the target or better, then they earn their incentives, and that's paid the next year. So based on that, they have been willing to implement the programs, and they have mostly overachieved and underspent their budgets. And here are, I'm looking at our rules, and it talks about the benefits and objectives of the energy efficiency programs. They're pretty general. It's Section 2 of the rules provides those benefits and objectives, and it talks about meeting objectives like energy savings directly attributable to program activities, permanent peak electric demand reduction, energy cost savings and cost effectiveness, reliability. It doesn't say you shall do smart thermostats or weatherization. Those were things that just sort of came out of the programs that the utilities knew about and engaged their third-party contractors to bring to them. And the commission then approved the plans going forward, and the cost recovery followed suit.
Right. So let's see if we're getting this straight. So there's not independent administration. However, the utilities, your IOUs, they are the ones that will design the portfolio that they believe are conforming to your regs, and then they go ahead and outsource the implementation of that program to a third party.
That's right. That's the way it works. And they come in with their estimates of what the savings will be, and then they implement and demonstrate what they achieved. And then they are able to, the commission approves the recovery for those costs and their incentives that they are able to collect the next year.
Got it. So if possible, Wally, if we can spend 5 minutes into the collaborative rulemaking, can you give us a little bit of your experience? How did you create that? What were what is the feedback in regards to that kind of rulemaking out there in Arkansas?
Well, the commission has used the model that we did with energy efficiency and a number of other processes, not always successfully, but in this particular case, I think it worked very well. Having a facilitator was very important. At that point, it was Rich Sedano of RAP was our facilitator for most of that year, 2006. We had the parties involved. The commission the commissioners attended the meetings of the collaborative and educated themselves about efficiency. We now have a collaborative underway on distributed energy resources, and the same is true. The commissioners are in attendance and listening and asking questions sometimes, and occasionally making comments, not terribly often. They're mainly listening. And the parties are at the table, and they sometimes go off and meet together in working groups and then come back and make reports. I do not, at the commissioner advisor level, I don't sit in on the collaborative activities when they are doing their working group activities, but if there's a public meeting, then, you know, all of us can attend. And they work on issues. The collaborative over the years continued to help refine the programs. They came up with what's called the consistent weatherization approach that the utilities are now implementing. They came up with an improvement to commercial energy efficiency programs. They work together on programs on the EM&V. The collaborative worked on that after the rulemaking was adopted. EM&V came about, and incentives, they worked together on that. So I think the collaborative has been a very good process.
Wally, this is PJ Wilson again. I got to say, from our perspective in Puerto Rico here, we really appreciate the input from the Midwest there. From my perspective as a Missourian, I got to tell you, I'm embarrassed. You guys were a few years ahead of us. We went through just an identical process to what you're talking about in Missouri, right down to Rich Sedano facilitated it for us in Missouri too. We went through this collaborative rulemaking process where it involved literally just the rule that was in development being up on the screen on the whiteboard with all the stakeholders giving input to the minutia of the detail of exactly what the rule was that was being developed. And it resulted in, at the very end of the process, everyone was included. Everyone didn't get everything they wanted, but there was this widespread sense of support for the rule that came out because it had been developed in a series of workshops sort of like this, but focused on the actual rule itself that was being developed. So the end result was not a surprise to anybody. It was this thing that was developed collaboratively by everybody.
Yeah,
I think that sounds encouraging. Yeah, over the years, the commission has come up with different topics that they would refer to the collaborative to work on and make recommendations and reports. The collaborative came in back in 2013, I believe it was, and said, we'd like to do an energy efficiency potential study, and we need to engage a company to do that. And the commission said, okay. And I think they engaged Navigant, and they got a report done the next year. Oddly enough, interestingly enough anyway, the achievement of the utilities has far exceeded what the potential was shown to be by Navigant. So that sort of informed the process in later years of raising the targets, because we were able to see what had actually been done that was in excess of what had been predicted. And so that's another topic, is that the commission comes up with an issue they would like the collaborative to work on, then they will direct them to spend time on it and make a report. And most recently, I think one of the topics has been whether the the National Standard Practice Manual that is now out there in the public should be adopted in some way to refine the cost effectiveness test of the commission. And the commission decided to take some steps in that direction at the recommendation of the parties. That's still pending to a certain extent, by adopting some non-energy benefits in the cost effectiveness test.
Now, one of the things that we need to highlight, and, having coming from the DCPSC that is more than 100 years old, I mean, the Puerto Rico Energy Bureau truly has to be commended, because they're already 5, 6 years old. And they took it from the get-go to have these proceedings involving the people, engaging people. We got also we have about 3 or 4 other proceedings that actually, like PJ is saying, we got an electric distribution initiative that's exactly what we're doing. We're putting the proposed directives to throw it at people to see what they're thinking so we can gain efficiencies. So by the time an OPR goes out there, hopefully it will go a lot easier. So I think it needs to be commended. I think they are very serious about engaging the stakeholders. It shows to the level of effort that they have been putting through the summer. And I want to leave it on that note because I'm contrasting what my experience is in the district and what they're doing, what we're doing here in Puerto Rico, and it's truly to be commended. Listen, Wally, this has been fantastic.
Could I
please.
just say something to reinforce what you said? Like, absolutely agree. That it feels to me like we are here now as a process leading up to this more advanced collaborative rulemaking thing that we're headed towards. That at our experience in Missouri, we had over 100 years of regulatory experience that led up to the process that was there. And I don't know, Wally, how long has the regulator been around in Arkansas?
It was created in 1935, an outgrowth of a railroad commission, I think, probably much older than that.
Yeah.
But, in those days, what they were trying to do in the 30s and 40s and 50s was to get people to use more electricity and bring the cost down. And so they were mandating that the utility lower its rates in order to spread the message around that people should use it. And we got into a different world after that as rates went up. I was going to ask one last thing. If Jorge, if you have this set of materials, the third set I sent you, the summary of annual reports.
I do. So let me pull it up. Yep. Summary.
Because
how did you?
It's very, very useful. This was prepared by our general staff. The general staff of the commission is a party before the commission. I don't work for the general staff. I work for the commissioner's staff. But if you look at this, if you just scroll through it, for example, on the first page, there's a table that the staff prepared on the savings targets and how they grew over those years. You can see, just as a fact, that the targets for the gas companies have been stable for several years. They don't have as much potential for savings. But there are the docket numbers that you could look at to see where they were when they were raised in the different years. We haven't really, that doesn't show the 1.2 that we're now in, but that did happen in that same 13002 docket. And then some of the other slides show the amount of expenditures. Entergy, again, is spending $57 million a year, roughly. And I'm going to mention one other fact. In the last 3 or 4 years, our utilities got the legislature to pass a law authorizing formula rate plans, which is an annual review instead of a general rate case. And so some of the factors of a rate case are not going to be tinkered with, like the rate of return. But the utilities can opt into a formula rate plan for 5 years, and they make an annual filing, and they can show that their expenses have gone up. It's capped at 4% a year increase, which utilities do seem to come right up against that. But on that slide that's on, I guess, page 19 of these numbered pages, you'll see the column called LCFT, lost contribution to fixed costs.
Yep.
For Entergy, it is blank.
Yep.
Because they get an annual review, and we don't have an LCFC factor on the rate energy efficiency cost recovery rider anymore, because it's captured in the annual rate case. And it means that because the LCFC is the fixed cost that would otherwise have been recovered if no efficiency had been done. So essentially it's in there. SWEPCO, the second utility listed there, still had LCFC of $5.6 million, and that would have been included in their overall costs of recovery. But it's going away because they adopted an FRP, and so has OG&E. So in some ways, the LCFC element is gone away, and we will only have the actual expenses directly spent by the utilities on the programs and the performance incentives. The LCFC will be recovered in the annual reviews. And that also shows the TRC and the utility or program administrator cost results. So, but there are other good tables in here that I hope you'll take a look at, and if you have questions about them, I'll be glad to respond.
Thank you very much, Wally. So we're going to be putting this in our website so people can look at this, and then we're going to make sure that that you're also on MS Teams, so we can continue collaboration. Listen, Wally, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for collaborating with us. We look forward for continued engagement. I think it was right on target.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to help, and look forward to maybe one day getting down your way.
Absolutely. Looking forward to that. Have a good one, Wally. Thank you much.
All right. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
So, algo que podemos hacer en este momento, en verdad que le doy las más expresivas gracias. We did it for this final stretch. Estamos aquí a lo último, una tarde del viernes. Algo que vamos a hacer, toda esta información la vamos a poner en el website. Entonces, todo el mundo, por favor, antes que se vaya, deje su email, porque con el email nosotros vamos a darle el enlace para que se pueda conectar a través de MS Teams. En MS Teams tenemos un documento el cual usted puede continuar colaborando y puede poner sus colaboraciones en un documento, un MS Doc, que usted puede editar, usted puede conseguir contribuyendo en el teléfono o la computadora. Muchísimas gracias por estar con nosotros. Se recuerda que el cuarto taller lo tenemos en marzo 27. Y por favor, antes de que se vayan, por favor, si pueden llenar una hojita de estas, se la agradezco. Esto es un esfuerzo que tiene mucha gente.
Yo tenía un comentario para finalizar.
Sí, cómo no.
En muchas ocasiones hoy y en otras sesiones hemos oído, hay gente que dice que hace falta más educación. Y yo lo que pienso es que es un proceso distinto a solamente la educación. Porque lo que sucede es que es una cuestión cultural y una cuestión de conducta. De la misma manera que que hay gente que nunca se pone el cinturón y saben que le van a dar un ticket o que pueden morir y a la misma vez no se lo ponen, o gente que sabe que si siguen fumando se van a morir y les va a pasar ataque del corazón, cáncer en el pulmón. O sea que no es, la educación ayuda a cierta gente hasta cierto punto, pero para cambiar una conducta tan parte del puertorriqueño de usar toda la electricidad que quiere en todo momento, porque eso está disponible, es una cuestión de que es lo que se llama en la salud mental el cambio de conducta, que conlleva un proceso más a fondo para ver qué es lo que esa persona valora de su conducta y qué es lo qué valor le puede sacar a cambiar la conducta. O sea, no es decirle, mira, no uses tanta luz porque puedes ahorrar dinero, entonces, si no me importa. Pero entonces ver por qué no le importa, por qué no quiere cambiar su conducta. Es un proceso un poco más complicado, como tratarle de que alguien deje de fumar, que alguien haga más ejercicio, que alguien se ponga el cinturón, que alguien se cepille los dientes. O sea, es un proceso mucho más complicado que solamente educación y es algo que conllevaría más discusión, porque si tú quieres que alguien cambie su conducta para ejercitarse más, no es solamente decirle, mira, si no te ejercitas, pues te va a hacer daño a la salud, sino que tiene que haber algo más que decírselo. Entonces también la persona tiene que saber lo que le llamas autoeficacia, que puede hacer el cambio. Y ese generalmente es el primer paso. Puedo tomar media hora y ejercitarme todos los días. Ese es el primer paso de ese cambio de conducta. Si la persona siente, pues no voy a poder hacer el cambio, pues entonces no lo va a hacer. Y eso tú lo oyes mucho aquí, pues eso siempre es así. Eso siempre va a ser así. Hay rotos en la carretera, hay tapones en la carretera, la luz está cara. Eso siempre va a ser así. Pues es un cambio de conducta, de autoeficacia, para entonces moverse hacia otro sitio.
Definitivamente, no, muchísimas gracias por compartir, porque eso es parte de la cultura, lo que estamos viendo aquí, y gracias por darnos ese tipo de información. Como le digo, estamos aquí en marzo 27, muchísimas gracias por estar con nosotros y por colaborar, y que tengan bonita tarde. Muchísimas gracias.